Welcome back to another episode of Western Tabletop. I'm going to start a new video series where I'm going to teach you how to paint tanks, or any vehicle for that matter. Now, there's a couple of key reasons why I wanted to do this, and one of the first ones is it was something that I really struggled with. I started out with my miniature painting journey, just like I'm sure a lot of you did, with Games Workshop and their base, wash, layer, edge highlight process. Now that's a really good process for getting started. It's actually also pretty malleable as you kind of advance and improve as a painter. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work very well for vehicles. You get tide marks, you get some of the edge highlights sometimes look a little bit weird, and that was something that I didn't really like. So I wanted to get better at it, and I wanted to make my vehicles really pop on the table. But I also didn't want to spend forever doing it. So I ventured out into scale modeling, and I spent forever getting my vehicles to look good and to get them to pop. But I picked up a few techniques along the way, and I've worked on them a little bit, and I've hopefully simplified them as well. And I've worked out a process where you can get vehicles from primed to display ready well above tabletop standard in a painting process that only takes a couple of hours. And I'm going to show that to you. The most important reason is that life is busy. It's filled with distractions and competing priorities that take us away from our hobby tables. And sometimes even just finishing one model is an achievement. And that is actually something that you and I and all of us should be proud of. Even if it's just one paratrooper out of 30 or one poxwalker out of 120, it is a job well done. Even if it's finished and just tabletop standard and all of the other stuff that we like to impose on ourselves as not good enough, it's a job finished. And so with this process here, I'm going to be able to get you to not just finish your vehicles in a quick, efficient manner, but also to get them look really great. And ultimately, the most important reason is that I want you to be proud of your models, because you deserve to be. The first thing that I'll cover in this series is getting your base coat down, and we're going to do this lightning fast. We're going to be using a much maligned technique, dry brushing. If you don't have the makeup brushes in your house that you don't mind brutalizing, I suggest you grab a cheap set from your nearest department store. Certainly don't drop big dollars on them. If you have something like this tank brush, or this large dry brush rather, that'll work fine too. The key thing that we're looking for here is lots of small, soft bristles, and preferably if they're a little bit longer, that'll make it a little bit easier as well. The first step in this process is to prime your model with a dark contrasting color. In this case, I'm using this Tiger One's turret, and I'm going to be painting it in Panzer Grau, so I started with a black undercoat. If you're painting olive drab or dark yellow, a really dark brown would work as a primary color, but if you've only got black, that'll work just fine as well. Then we'll need to pick about 3 to 4 colors that are between your primary color and white, with your desired color being somewhere in the middle. Of course, we're not painting anything black to white, but the thing that we want to achieve here is value contrast. Value contrast is the difference in brightness, or it could be saturation, between the brightest highlight and the darkest shadow. A nice big range will look really appealing, and that's what gets your models to pop. We have to be careful with pure black and pure white when we're painting with colors though. Fortunately, Panzer Grau, or grey, is very forgiving. I'm using Citadel Eschen Grey, Vallejo Medium Grey, Vallejo Sea Grey, and Citadel Ulthuan Grey. Any similar color would work. The key here is that we've got about 3 to 4 that spread a nice range of value contrast. Starting with Eschen Grey, we're going to load some on our brush and clean most of it off on a paper towel. Once most of it's gone, we're going to start applying it. The key here is lots of little circles. I find that that's a way to get really good coverage with the dry brush, and we want to make sure that we're leaving a little bit of black in the recesses. That's pretty easy to do with a dry brush, and so we're just going to keep working this now. What we want to do here is have a heavy dry brush. That doesn't mean that we have more paint on the brush, it just means that we do more and more passes, and typically something in like a circular motion. Now we've got a good Escher grey layer. We're going to repeat basically what we just did with the next shade up. This time I'm going to try to use circles a little bit less and try to dry brush and kind of straight up and down, avoiding kind of lateral side to side motions. It's not a really big deal in this particular layer, but this is just something that we have to avoid as we go up in colors. Basically, we go from doing circular dry brushing more like vertical dry brushing. That's really key for the vertical sides as we go up in colors. On the faces, as I call them at the top, you can't really do that. You have to go in circles. But again, nice thin layers, and we'll just slowly build up that color. Now it's time for layer 3. Here we've got to be more careful painting only with downstrokes when we come to these vertical edges. One thing to keep in mind is that upstrokes can be a little bit tricky. They can pick up edges that wouldn't necessarily catch the light, and it can stuff up your light placement. It's really forgiving on a vehicle like this, straight vertical sides, but if the lower edge is more in than the top edge, that's something you've got to be really careful of. And when we get to this face at the top, we're just painting in circles again. One thing to keep in mind is make sure those previous colors are still visible. Again, we're going to try to avoid catching these edges around the base of the turret. Finally, a really light dry brush of our off-white. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, be mindful about how you're dry brushing instead of the directions here. I'm going for a winter-themed force. This is an off-white, and this is grey. I have a lot of margin for error here, and it's kind of difficult to overdo. And there we have it. There's a couple of things I really like about this technique. The recesses stay nice and black as if you'd done the pin shading, and that lets us skip a very typical step in the scale modeling process. The dry brushing gives it a really certain texture and grittiness, which feels really right for historical combat vehicles. And of course, the most important thing, we've got some nice, lovely value contrast. Note that in the lower part of the turret, and the hull, particularly around the suspension, I didn't use all 4 of the greys, just the lower 1 or 2. That really helps to place the sun into the scene and gives what I tend to call structure. It's this idea that there is a dark part of the model and a bright part of the model just because it's outside or there's a natural light source. You can do this whole technique with an airbrush as well, and here's what that looks like. You won't get these edge highlights of the textures that we talked about before, but instead you'll get a really nice smooth gradient and modulation that you can apply in such a specific way that you can't really match. I'll do a separate video on that in more detail, but if you're comfortable with a dry brush, and now you understand value contrast, this is something that you can smash out really quickly. The more colors that you use between black and white, the more forgiving and robust this technique is. You can get really great results by dropping out some in-between colors, but it just requires a lot of patience and control. The reason is you're trying to create the illusion of all those in-between colors with dry brushing. You can use that principle for any color, blue, red, purple, or even pink. Another way of achieving value contrast is by flipping that and doing it with saturation. That's really the modus operandi for Games Workshop and that style of painting. If you want something a little bit more realistic, go with desaturation for value contrast. But ultimately, it's your model and it's your visuals. Do whatever you feel looks the best. Tune into the rest of the series where I'm going to go through things like chipping, weathering, and things like that that'll really give a lot of life and character to your model. That'll help smooth and sell this really stark contrast that we've got here. With that all being said, I'm now going to repeat one of my favorite quotes about painting from my friend Adrian, who is a phenomenal painter. Let's get out there and let's paint bravely.